I was asked to talk about communication and culture, and that's a really broad, set of stuff to talk about. And we've had to hone in on some very specific bits of work that we've done that are actually, I thought were the most relevant and perhaps interesting for you all today. So really what we want to talk about is four key things. First of all, we want to start by just talking about the social environment of the construction site. What's it like working in construction, and why is that social environment important for health and safety? And also then leadership. So what leaders, what particularly frontline leaders can do to create a really good supportive environment where healthy and safe work takes place. Third, we want to talk about humour and the use of humour in the workplace. We've been doing some research very recently, actually. It's not complete, but we're going to present some preliminary results on that, looking at the way humour can impact people, both negatively and positively. And obviously, we want to see it having a positive impact, but unfortunately, it can, in fact, be negative in some circumstances. And we want to, actually not just talk about that, but explore what you think about that too. Lastly, we want to talk about change in the industry, and a piece of work that I've been involved with for the last 4 years, which is a major culture change in the construction industry, where the government agencies, the clients' organisations, and the contracting bodies have actually collaborated to try and change the culture of the industry with specific reference to mental health and well-being, gender diversity and equality, and time for life, so work hours and work-life balance. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the social experience of work. And what's important when people are deciding whether or not to work in construction. And I want to present a bit of information that we've collected from young workers in the Australian construction industry. This is quite recent work, but I think it's actually really interesting, and it tells us something about how young workers are thinking about the industry that we all work in and enjoy working in, but young workers are looking at it from a different lens with a different perspective. So a couple of years ago, I got the opportunity to collect data from trainees in the New South Wales construction industry. These trainees were young workers who had joined the industry to undertake a vocational education program over a 2-year period. So they were school leavers post-COVID who hadn't decided what they wanted to do yet. And 120 of them were recruited to go through this traineeship program, and then another 120 of them were recruited the next year. We were able to follow those two cohorts through their process. So what they did with these youngsters was that they put them through vocational education courses in construction management and other construction-related fields. And they also, at the same time, gave them work experience in the sector. That work experience involved rotating between a construction contracting organisation, a client organisation, and a design organisation, and they did 8 months in each of those. During the course of that period, we were able to interview them and survey them and just ask them what they thought. What was really interesting is that a lot of them, after 8 months in the industry, had decided that they didn't want to work in it. So they'd already made their mind up after one job rotation, this isn't the industry for me. But some of them thought that there was the industry they wanted to work in, and that was good, because obviously the objective of this traineeship program was to, attract workers to the industry and hopefully retain them. This diagram shows the, we asked them 24 things related to work, so 24 job characteristics. And we asked them 2 questions about those job characteristics. We asked them, is this important to you when choosing a career? And do you think it's going to be available to you if you enter the construction industry? And these 2 lines, so the blue line is what's important, the orange line is whether they think they're going to get it in the industry. And you can see that the blue and orange lines for this group that have made their minds up to work in construction are pretty similar, right? But we'll look at the next graph, because this is the people who were undecided or had really decided that they absolutely didn't want to work in the sector. Big difference, right? And you can see that the blue line is much bigger in some places than the orange line. But what's really important about this is if you actually look at the things where that gap exists in the top right-hand corner, it's things like colleagues I can get along with, an enjoyable job, having a pleasant work environment. And then if you look at this left-hand side here, it's having a healthy lifestyle, having hours that don't impact my personal life, having control over my work time, and gender diversity and fairness. So the things that we're talking about where people, these young workers are seeing the biggest gaps are actually all around culture, the things that we're talking about today. And importantly, these gaps predicted statistically their decision or not to enter the construction industry. So when I show this data to people in the industry in Australia who are really concerned about the skills shortages and the ability of the industry to attract people to it, it tells a story about the importance of culture and the importance of addressing some of these cultural aspects of the industry that make it particularly challenging for some people. So when we asked the trainees in interviews what they loved about the industry, and it wasn't all negative, like a lot of the trainees were saying, but we really enjoyed this job rotation, it was really great. And when we said, well, what were the things that you liked the most about it? They said, oh, we love the practical tasks. We love actually working with our hands. A lot of them didn't want to be behind a desk. That was a big attractive feature for them. And that's really good because they really loved that aspect. They loved the sense of accomplishment. We can see things physically come together. We can see the product of our work, and it's terrific. And the other thing they talked about was teamwork. We like working together as part of a team, and that sense of working as a team was a really important feature that these young folks loved. But when we asked them what they didn't love, there was a lot of stuff as well, and it was long working hours, work overload, just feeling constantly rushed, not having enough time to complete their work, no time for life. So, work consumed all of their time and they were tired and had no time to engage in things outside of work. Some talked about unsupportive team members. They were working with people who they described as difficult, toxic, problematic, challenging. And some said, stress. What's really interesting as well, and it's worth noting, is that these youngsters, while they were in this rotation, their work hours were limited. They weren't allowed as part of the program to work more than 37 and a half hours a week. So they were picking this up vicariously by watching the people around them. They weren't even working the long hours. They were just looking at other folks and going, no, that's not for me. That looks like, a job that is not going to be something that I'm going to be happy with. So I think that's kind of an interesting observation as well, because they vicariously were picking that up. The other thing the trainees talked about was the social environment. That was a really big thing for them. And I think that's true of all of us. We all want to work in a place where we like people like us, we get treated with respect. And the youngsters talked about this sense of community. They talked about having a sense of community being important, and construction's probably the best place to get that. Now, that's great because that's a really good thing. And if we can create that sense of community and that sense of engagement with the industry and the work that people do within it, we're likely to attract people, retain them, and have a happy, healthy workforce. And they talked about the camaraderie between the teams, between each other. And they talked about you spend a lot of time at work. And because you're spending all that time at work, you want it to be good. You want that experience to be positive. Which leads me to the next piece of research that we've done around this concept of sense of place. So one of the problems with the construction industry, as you said, is constantly changing, and the workforce is constantly changing. So you don't have the opportunity necessarily to, usually anyway, get to know the people you're working with. So I've already said that camaraderie is important, the teamwork's important, but how do you actually do that when you've got a workforce that's constantly changing and you've got people coming in, and also in an environment where, sometimes relationships can be hard, there can be conflict and tension and some challenges to those relationships. And we were challenged with this in a major infrastructure project in Melbourne. And we had to think about what makes a sense of place, what makes a place a positive place to be. And we looked at some community psychology literature, and we came up with this notion of sense of place, which basically is a connection with a physical place usually, but it doesn't have to be physical. It can be a collection of people who know one another through other networks. But in terms of, we looked at what does that look like in a construction project? How can we create within construction projects a social environment where people, feel connected and feel that they belong and actually want to be there because they enjoy it? And we identified 6 components of this sense of place. And the 6 components are community, engagement, respect, life balance, support, and resilience. And we said, all of these things are in fact correlated and statistically related to good mental health. So we looked at these things, said, how can we create construction workplaces that have these characteristics? Because we believe these characteristics are actually really important for people, and yet they're not necessarily easy to create within construction, or they're not necessarily present in all workplaces. We developed a measurement method for that sense of place concept because there was an interest from the industry partners that we were working with to know, can we measure this? Do we know if we've got a sense of place? How do we know if we've got one? How do we know if we haven't got one? Is there a way we can tell if one project's got one and the other one doesn't? And so we were able to test that survey in the New Zealand construction industry. We were able to do some data collection at a project here in New Zealand. In fact, more than one. We ended up collecting data from multiple projects. But this is the data from one of those projects. We measured all the different elements of sense of place. You can see that there along the bottom here. We also used a positive measure of mental well-being. So we didn't want to measure depression and anxiety and the things that often researchers focus on. We actually specifically found a reliable and validated measure of positive mental well-being. And that measure of positive mental well-being actually has population norm data. So we were able to use those population norms to break the people up into people who have low mental well-being, people who have medium well-being, and people who are of high mental well-being. And you can see the black lines are the people with high mental well-being. And what this graph shows, and I think it's actually a really neat graph, it shows that there is actually a correlation there. So where you actually have these sense of place elements, where people are experiencing those, they're more likely to fall into that high mental well-being category. So I guess what this told us is that that sense of place survey, instrument, questionnaire, tool is actually quite useful for helping us to understand how we can create mentally healthy workplaces. And where we were coming from with this was very much a positive psychology approach. We were sort of saying, yes, organizations definitely need to understand psychosocial risks. Yes, they definitely need to work to eliminate those and prevent people from being harmed. And in Australia now, that's a legal requirement for people to focus specifically on that. And there's regulations that call it out as a separate kind of area of risk that needs to be managed, even though it was probably covered anyway. But what this tells us is, aside from that, we also should potentially be thinking about how do we create workplaces where people can actually flourish and where people can actually enjoy their work. And this is one way of potentially thinking about it. On these projects where we collected this data, there was a concerted effort by the clients and the contractors, but initiated by the clients, which I think is really important, to actually really develop this sense of place. So they didn't just do this by accident. They consciously went into it and thought, how can we create our physical worksite facilities? How can we actually, design the workplace and the places where people eat and have some rest time during the day? How can we design those places to have the best possible outcome for the people who are using them? How can we break down silos between subcontractors? How we can create places where people can be physically active and engage with each other, and so that we can create a sort of community and communication and collaboration between subcontractors as well. And that conscientious effort to do that led to a really positive experience for the workers who were on those projects, to the point where these are some of the interview comments when we went to talk to the workers and interview them. They talked about, these projects being personally rewarded, being part of a team, really enjoying that teamwork. And even though the project was really challenging and everybody accepted that, and there were multiple hurdles, being part of the team and actually engaging in those conversations and being, caring for one another was actually a really important feature of this work. And I particularly like this quote down the bottom, bottom right, where somebody talked about the entire management team on this project had created an environment where this person actually said, this has turned my life around. Being on this project has turned my life around. So it was a really positive experience. And I think, thinking about that social environment and how and why it's important, and understanding its importance is really, and potential to impact health and safety and well-being of the workforce is really important to consider. Which leads me to the next section of the presentation, which is, I guess, to pose another question to you about who influences the social environment in the workplace, and who are the people who have the most influence in shaping the sorts of things that I've just been talking about. So, as frontline leaders? Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, frontline leaders play a really critical role in the construction industry because they're the conduit through which management communicates to the workforce how they want work to be done. And you're the people who have the most, the day-to-day interaction with the workforce and can really, make a difference to those, local work group, environments and cultures. Great, thank you, everybody. And look, really interestingly, during the break, a couple of people have come up and talked about that last exercise we did, and really good points raised. I mean, one of the points is context matters, Did the worker who was late, was it a pattern of behavior? Have they had prior warnings about that? Obviously, those things do influence the decisions that you make as a supervisor in relation to how you would respond. So, thanks everybody for engaging with that, because there's a lot of really interesting insights that you've brought up in that exercise. So Jack left us with the idea that it's not just about the apprentices, obviously not just about the workers, that the frontline leaders have a really important role to play in the tone of communication that happens in the workplace. And they're actually more important than probably the apprentices, because they actually do set the tone for the communication, and their communication choices can really, shape the culture of the work group, and ultimately the way people in that work group respond to requests, to information about how to work and how to work safely, and the willingness to follow correct procedures and so on. We did a study of frontline supervision. We wanted to really understand what it was about frontline leaders that's good, and what do frontline leaders do on a daily basis practically to actually, produce the right kind of outcomes. This work was done using a methodology called ethnography, which is a research word for basically being a fly on the wall. So our researcher, who's not here today, David Oswald, he actually went out on a site. He spent, I think, 160 or so hours on actually multiple sites, shadowing the frontline leaders, shadowing, them and watching what they did on a daily basis. So a lot of hours of data collection to understand what it was frontline leaders were doing on a practical daily basis that made a difference. And some of the things that people told us about, and these are just some quotes from that data collection, was, respect specialist subcontractors. Don't pretend you've got knowledge that you haven't got. If a specialist subcontractor has that expert knowledge, engage with them and respect that knowledge. Don't go telling them stuff that you don't know about, because you're not going to get a good result. They talked about the foreman being out there every day, walking around, chatting to people on a personal level. If they see things that aren't right, don't just go up and tell people off. Actually chat with them. You could do this better. How could we fix this? Have that conversation and treat them like a human being, rather than just going and telling people what to do in a command and control type manner. They talked about when you've got subcontractors and they might not be the best, it doesn't matter if this is a quote, doesn't matter how shit they are, it's something you've got to manage. And you see a change in culture when you bring them to your standards that you can't budge on. So you might have some standards that this is non-negotiable. On our project, we want you to do this. They then go back on another job and learn other ways of working, come back to your job. So it was this constant interaction between the foreman and the subcontractors, supervisors, the subcontracted personnel, to really make sure that those standards were maintained, and explaining to them that that this was the way of working in this particular work site according to this particular contractor, but while importantly respecting the specialist knowledge that those subcontractors bring. to the table, sorry. And so what we did as part of this study, there's a document over there, we developed a bit of a maturity model, and we sort of identified different things and actually mapped what we learned from that ethnographic, site-based observation, shadowing, learning, talking to the frontline leaders about what was good and what was not good. And that document's over there for anyone who wants to take a copy on their way out. But I mean, thinking about your own workplace, given what I've just said, I want you to think about the following as we look at the next bit of research data. You know, think about what communication looks like in your workplace. Think about how you share information about health and safety with the workforce, whether they be directly employed or subcontracted. And think about how you solve problems. And just sort of think about those things when we show the next slide. So as part of that study, we collected a lot of data about how communication about health and safety is actually done in a work group. And we asked people, who do you talk about health and safety with in your work group? And we asked them how frequently they talked about health and safety with all of those group members. And we also then measured this thing called safety climate, which is basically within that work group, how much people think safety is a priority. Now, how much emphasis is placed on safety? How important is safety relative to production and other objectives? So safety climate, if you like, is a measure of whether the group thinks safety is really important or not. So this sort of data really shows talking matters, and how you talk, how frequently you talk about these things actually matters. And so work groups have their own structures of communication, and those communication structures actually make a difference. The output, I guess, from this research, and remember, it was based on 160 or so hours of shadowing supervisors on real sites, watching their day-to-day practice, as well as talking to health and safety advisors and others. The output was we concluded that at the front line in a construction project, supervision is not, it's complex. It's not just one person. In fact, it's a leadership ecosystem. So we actually identified all these different facets, A, B, C, D, E, and F, of that ecosystem that make a difference for health and safety. So we talked about the relationship between principal contractors, supervisors, and the supervisors of the subcontractors. Obviously, that relationship's important. And we actually identified what was good practice, what was less good practice for those. We talked about the leadership behaviors of the foreman and the supervisors. We talked about the relationship between the principal contractor supervisors, and subcontracted workers, because they actually have an interaction as well. We talked about the communication and coordination between different subcontractors, supervisors, so a lateral relationship, which also has an impact. And we talked about communication about health and safety within subcontracted work groups, like I've just kind of showed you with those network diagrams. And then we talked about the relationship with health and safety advisors, so the way that work group members and their supervisors interact with the health and safety advisors and vice versa. Model that's over there in that document that we've shared, if anyone wants to take a copy, was based on this deep ethnographic study of exactly what people do in their day-to-day activity at the front line, as well as some of our survey data around what made a difference. And so if anyone wants to take it, that's fine. But focusing on that F, that relationship F, which is the relationship between the health and safety advisors, so the health and safety professionals, and members of the work group, including the supervisor. And we identified 3 levels of maturity around this relationship. You can see here on the left, this is a low maturity situation where the health and safety advisor is seen as a policeman. They seem to actively disrupt progress. We don't like talking to them every time they come, they stop us doing stuff. The supervisor responds to that by trying to hide issues and doesn't consult or value the health and safety advisor, so that advisor effectively isn't effective in their role. And as a result, issues are slow to be resolved, and the relationship's really quite dysfunctional. And we did see work groups where that was the situation. The other side of that, and there's this situation in the middle. You can pick up a copy of this, and it goes through all of those A to F relationships and in more detail than this. So there's a bit in the middle where they kind of work, but it's still not an ideal relationship. But on the right, this is where things were working really well. In this situation, the supervisor was actively seeking advice from the health and safety advisors because they were seen as being helpful and useful. And the supervisor sought advice preemptively, not reactively. And the advisors also sought input and they valued practical experience. So they didn't come in a dictatorial way and impose their ideas. They acknowledged that the people who are doing the work actually know it best of all. And so they sought that practical input into their decision making and advice as well. And the supervisor was therefore willing to ask the advisors about how they could improve. And it was a very positive and respectful and effective working relationship. So this model is something that we've developed that goes through all of those relationships, A to F, and sort of talks about what good looks like and what less good looks like. And it was based on a lot of observation. But on that relationship between the principal contractors, health and safety advisors, and the subcontractors, this was one of the quotes that came from one of those advisors. And I just want to share it with you and then just get your thoughts on what you think the consequence of this type of relationship would look like. So this was the health and safety advisor who said, the subcontractors, they're not going to set up all the systems they need to for an hour's work if they don't have to. They'll hide things until they get caught. Then they'll say, oh yeah, I was going to tell you about that. Well, were they hell? So clearly not a lot of trust there. We keep employing the same subcontractors, so they should be used to our expectations and what we want, but sometimes it doesn't feel like that. And our last resort is to get them all in the shed and give them a good slap. I mean, that's not likely to create a good outcome from a health and safety point of view. And in fact, it's worse because giving them a good slap, getting them in the sheds was effectively the way they did that was they got them back in and they put them through a reinduction process that took 2 hours. It obviously cost the subcontractor money because all their folks had to come in and be reinducted for 2 hours. Clearly, that's going to put them under financial pressure, possibly time pressure. All of these things could play out to potentially, create further shortcuts, risk taking, and so on, and put people under undue stress. But also, it's using the induction process as a punishment. Something that should be good for safety. They've turned it into a punishment. And, I don't know if any of you have any experiences in relation to this, but certainly that type of approach doesn't seem to be helpful. And yet we were seeing this in some of the sites we were looking at. On the opposite side, we were seeing really good relationships as well, but they were quite different. The reason I share this is that, as I said, the maturity model talks about all those relationships and what good and bad and in the middle looks like. And I think it's one way of actually reflecting on our work practices and thinking, in my workplace, how do I respond to these types of situations? And am I responding in a way that's likely to produce good outcomes or indeed not so good outcomes? So yeah, I don't know if anyone's got any comments or thoughts on that particular quote, but it really shocked us that that was actually the way some health and safety advisors thought was the best way to do their job. I can see you nodding. All right, so moving on, our current research, and this is work we're still doing, is on workplace humour. And in particular, we've been funded by the New South Wales government to look at humour as it specifically impacts women. We've been funded under a Women in Construction programme. And I guess that's why we've got in brackets all harassment, because in fact, some humour probably shouldn't even be described as humour. The humour that is actually sexual harassment, we shouldn't even be describing that as humour. And unfortunately, we found it, quite a lot of that in our survey we've completed recently. So just to backtrack, and I'm sure you'll hear much more of this type of idea from Steve, and I'm really looking forward to hearing him speak because, we're actually looking at humour at the moment in this study. But one of the things that we've identified in the literature and the theory is that there are different kinds of humour, like not all humour is the same. And the humour you use in the workplace, therefore, needs to be considered because the humour can be different forms and it has very different impacts and outcomes. So positive humour, which is really good, and we actually want to see that in the workplace because it's good because it relieves stress, it makes work more enjoyable, it builds social cohesion in teams, and that's a really good thing. It can be positive, it can be stress relieving, and they're the green boxes at the top. The negative humour is where it causes harm to others, or where it's somebody who's making a joke and putting themselves down in a self-deprecating way and self-defeating way, which we're seeing in some of our results with particularly the apprentices and people who are lacking in confidence make jokes at their own expense, which, potentially is not that helpful, because it creates this sort of, it reinforces the power differences and some of those things that are not so helpful.
With these four categories as well, it's actually, when you think about it, quite hard, if you imagine instances of workplace humor, to place them neatly into these four categories. There's a lot of bleed through, and what seems like positive from one angle to someone else could seem like negative. And even with self-defeating, there's like some self-deprecating humor which is actually positive and shows that you actually have quite high self-esteem, since you're that confident, just be like, if you're an idiot like me, blah, 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 blah. But then it's very hard to, when you just write it down on paper, to sort of tell what it is. You kind of, a lot of times, have to be there. So think about, while we're talking about these next few case studies, just like if you were to put it in a few words, humor at work crosses the line when it is, and sort of fill in the blanks for yourselves. But I think it's best we speak right now. But so we've got a little case study here. I don't know if this made the news here in New Zealand, but it was hot. It was hot off the press in Australia. So there's this radio host, Marty Sheargold, who basically has been in hot water for making some comments about the Matildas, the Australian soccer team. So on Monday, women's soccer team, I should say, that's important. So on Monday, he's on air at his job saying, do you know what they remind me of? Year 10 girls. Sorry to undermine the whole sport, but that's what I think of it, so you can stick it up your ass. And he continues on, oh God, the Women's Asian Cup. I'd rather hammer a nail through the head of my penis than watch that. Got any men's sport? Co-hosts attempt to continue talking about the She Believes Cup, while Sheargold interjects, she believes in what? It better be men. And so there was a bit of heat off the back of that. And then the next day, he's back at his job again, still on air. And this time he says, God, don't ladies carry on. Jesus Christ, there's no end of it. Honestly, endometriosis. And this is controversial. And his co-hosts are going, no, Marty, shut up. And he goes, no, I'm going to say it. It's not real. It's made up. It's a fake illness. And then come Wednesday, he's mutually parting ways with Triple M, the radio show. And he puts out this apology when he sort of frames it as some comedy that went wrong, basically. He says, any comedy, including mine, can miss the mark sometimes. And I can see why people may have taken offense at my comments regarding the Matildas. He doesn't mention the other stuff. I sincerely apologize. And then he's stepped down. And there's been a lot of responses, when I've been sort of just scrolling through all the comments on social media. Some people think that they went too far, and he was like, it's just a bit of banter. Why did you take him down? Other people think they didn't go far enough. Like, why the other hosts were all there, giggling the whole time. They clearly were not against it. They should be. And the producers and everyone. And it's, it took a lot of uproar for him to step down. And, obviously this isn't a construction workplace, but it is still a workplace. And I think some things to think about, regardless how you feel, is that when you, it's sort of, I guess the equivalent you could draw is that, number one, it was in a work environment. He probably, he could have said this down the pub with some people. And even if a reporter overheard, I don't know if he would have had to step down if that got reported. But the fact that he's putting that out on air to everyone in his workplace, and then, he seems to have a pretty consistent target, and he's got quite a long history of, this sort of, sexist humor against women. It's kind of the same, I suppose, if there was one guy on site that you're always is the target of the thing. I mean, it's the consistency of the targeting is when it, a clear, good indicator of whether it's crossing the line to be bullying or harassment. Is there something else we're going to say about this one?
Well, yeah, I was going to bring up a point that John mentioned the other night when I was talking to him about this, which is, Marty Sheargold's lost his job. Was that a good organizational response? And what about those other people? The other people in the room who were the producers, and they were all in on the joke. And so, to a certain extent, I guess the question is, should he have taken the rap for this as an individual, or was there something more cultural going on there at an organizational level that could have actually prevented this, or that could have actually contributed to it, that meant that he was getting away with this behavior, but in fact the organization is perhaps the entity that we should be really looking at dealing with, rather than the individual. So I don't have the answer to that. I think there's probably multiple views on it, but it's an interesting question. This particular case does in fact raise really interesting questions about what organizations should do to establish boundaries around what kind of humor is allowed and what kind of humor is encouraged, and indeed when people cross the line, how they're treated and what the organizational response is.
So when you get down to these questions, I mean, at the base level is just saying what is unacceptable humor, and everyone will have a different answer to that, and we'll never agree. Like you'll never even get 3 people to agree on that probably. But then you go down a level, and it's like what is unacceptable humor at work, and hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit closer to agreeing on that one. But then you can slice it even further and say what is unacceptable humor in construction. Now, should that be a different answer to just work in general? Maybe not, but in practice, it does seem to be that there is sort of, things you could probably get away with in construction humor that you might not be able to get away with working at Coles or what's it called here? Countdown? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's Woolies. Yeah. Yeah. But then there's another way you can slice it. One is unacceptable humor on site. When we've been noticing in our interviews that a lot of people have been saying, yeah, I used to work in the construction office, but wasn't a good cultural fit for me. I didn't feel like I could be who I was. And we're like, oh, what did you mean by that? And kind of what he meant was like, he wanted to make pretty dark humor type jokes, or, he wanted to he sort of felt like he was restrained in the office. But he's like, now I'm on the site. I just say whatever I want. Everyone laughs. It's really great. I fire my people. We're like, oh, okay. But we wouldn't really give any clear examples of the kind of jokes he was making. But and then, it's really contextual, because you can also just ask, what is unacceptable humor on this specific site with these specific people? You keep getting more and more into these more sort of tighter questions, but what it sort of flies on one site with these 5 guys is going to be completely different on another site over there, which leads us to context. So how does context shape humor? There's so many different contexts you can think about, which will lead to how a joke lands.
So the background to this was some work we did with the apprentices in New South Wales a couple of years ago. We've just shared some of that. This is one of the quotes we got from a young woman, an 18-year-old apprentice electrician, or electrical apprentice, I should say. She, in the interview, said, and this is a direct quote, "If you don't have a sense of humor with the boys in this industry, you won't get along with them. Because I'm a female, they're going to call me different things, but like saying, you stupid bitch, or the C word, nothing too bad." And then she said, it's not to the point where it's racist or discriminatory or anything. Like, indicating that this was normalized, that she had already accepted after, a very short time as an apprentice, that this was going to be the industry, that she would be treated like this if she stayed in the industry. And in fact, even worse, when we actually interviewed her about her recruitment process, she said, oh yeah, I was hired because I've got a thick skin. My supervisor asked me if I could take this humor before they actually made the decision to hire me. So it's really concerning, because in most workplaces that would be considered to be, discriminatory, offensive, in all sorts of ways unacceptable. And yet in construction, it's actually often normalized. And the women who experience it feel that they have to, in order to stay in the sector, they have to just take this. And some laugh along with it, because they think that if they don't laugh along with it, then they'll be seen as troublemakers, or they won't fit in, and they'll be socially ostracized. So this quote really led us to seeking funding in partnership with the Master Builders Association of New South Wales to seek funding from the New South Wales government, which we were successful in getting, and we're midway through this project. The outcome of this project, which we finished in the middle of this year, is some training materials for dealing with humor in the workplace. And so I'll just share with you some of the results that we got. So we asked an open-ended question in a survey to these women, what crosses the line for you? And these are the things that they told us. So, sexual humor was one of the big things people said cross the line. When it's personal, when it's offensive, when it's about your appearance, when it's gender-based, racist, or makes you feel uncomfortable. These are the kind of things that the women thought crossed the line. So when you reflect back to what Jack asked you before, to think about what crossed the line for you, how similar they are to what the women told us. And this was quite a large sample as well. So we were quite, I think it's really telling us some interesting things. Next slide. We also asked them what kind of humor they experienced in the workplace. And you can see these first 2 bars. were the positive humor that we just talked about. So makes work more enjoyable or it eases tense situations. And you can see they're high for both site and office-based women. And that's good. That's really good. We want that to be the case. We don't want to get rid of humor in the workplace. We're certainly not saying humor shouldn't be in the workplace, when it's good humor. But the negative and self-defeating humor, you can see here that they're considerably lower. So they don't happen as much as the positive humor, which is good. But you can see there's actually a significant difference between the experiences of office-based women and the experience of site-based women. And the site-based women are still copying quite a lot of this negative humor and using self-defeating humor as a way of sort of coping with that work environment. And that's a concern. We also asked them about the impacts of unacceptable humor. And again, this is sort of quite shocking in some sense of some of the impacts. The most frequently cited impact was it makes me feel embarrassed. But the next one down to that was it caused me to avoid certain situations. Women talked about not going on training programs, not taking work shifts, not attending meetings because they wanted to avoid the perpetrator of this kind of humor. And that's career limiting for women. I mean, if women are making those decisions in the workplace, then it will absolutely impact their ability to thrive and advance their careers. The next one down, it affected my mental health, again, quite frequent. And then further down, reduced confidence. It made me want to leave my job, but I couldn't. And I know talking to John, he found that particularly shocking. And it is shocking, and you think someone's in their job because they don't have an alternative, but they're exposed to this, and that's how it makes them feel, and that's concerning. So I guess we're sort of nearly done here, but should organizations implement measures to reduce negative humor? So the question is, if we know this is happening, what can organizations do to address it? And going back to our Marty Sheargold example, the radio shock jock, was there something that Triple M, the radio station, could have done to actually prevent that in the first place? And I think these are sort of important questions. What we asked also in our survey was whether the organizations had a policy around workplace humor. We've called it a banter policy, but if you don't like that language, it's really a policy that would actually address these issues in the workplace. And we found that the organization, that the women said, yes, a lot of them said we don't have a policy, some who did. But that policy seemed to make a really big difference to the outcomes of workplace humor. So the last thing I want to talk about before we finish up, and we're nearly done, but thank you very much for listening and engaging with us in this, is this project that I'm involved with in the Australian construction sector. It's called Culture in Construction, and it started in 2018 when a construction industry culture task force was established. This Culture in Construction task force comprises the New South Wales government, the Victorian government, and the Australian Constructors Association. So that's the body that represents the largest tier 1 contracts. I think there's 19 or so members now. And they all got together and said, look, we're really worried about the industry. We're not attracting people. We've got a skills shortage. Productivity's really not doing so well. We've actually got a cultural problem in the industry. What can we do? And so that group had met for, and I was actually a member of the task force. We met frequently for an extended period. And as a result, a culture standard was developed. And the culture standard, in its nutshell, is this. It tries to deal with 3 broad issues: gender diversity and inclusion, health and well-being in the workplace, and time for life, so work-life balance. And what the culture standard does, it specifies all sorts of things that organizations have to do in relation to these three areas. Probably most controversially, the working time, because what it does is it says that in construction projects that adhere to the culture standard or that implement the culture standard, workers shouldn't work more than 50 hours a week, and they should work no more than 5 days in 7. So 5 days, 50 hours, and perhaps. So that's probably the most controversial element of this. We've actually now trialed this in 5 projects from the very beginning to completion. We've got data on those 5 projects, and we've looked at everything from, did they finish on time? Were there any cost blowouts? Were people happy? Did people feel they had time for life? Would they prefer to work according to this? Or would they like to go back to the 6-day week and their previous work arrangements? And what's really interesting is that by and large, the experience on those projects has been super positive. The people we've interviewed and the people we've surveyed, the vast majority of them are very strongly supportive of this particular culture standard. And so much so that it's currently going through a process of being adopted and built into procurement practice and procurement policy. So government projects will actually require organizations to work in these ways and in accordance with this culture standard in the projects they procure. So it's actually a really, it's got some substance, it's really being leveraged, and it looks as though it's going to be adopted. It's so much so that the Commonwealth government have now written it into their federal funding agreements as well. So the federal funding agreements, where the Commonwealth government, provides money to state government, now reference, some of them, not all of them, but some of them reference workplace culture and the need to do things around gender, around work hours, and around health and well-being, which is a really positive outcome. So watch this space. There's a website, you can download all the documents and all the research reports and everything from that website, and it is actually a very fast developing work.